Let's talk about Star Trek.
No! No!
Sorry for the weird audio, by the way. I'm away from my setup at the moment, but we're gonna do this anyway. So, the Star Trek timeline. Kind of long and confusing, isn't it? There's like a whole reboot franchise that exists in an alternate timeline. There's a bunch of movies and shows and books and all kinds of stuff that you could really get into if you applied yourself. But as much as I'm sure you'd love me to read you the entirety of Star Trek Intellivore, today we're going to be focusing in on one Star Trek movie in particular. Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. This may seem like a weird choice. I mean, there are definitely more famous Star Trek films out there. Most people probably have heard of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. That's the famous one. Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home was the most successful one, and that one was about,
Admiral, there be whales here.
Yep, definitely a lot to talk about there, but as much as I think there is plenty to discuss about all of the old Star Trek films, I wanted to pick Star Trek V specifically because, there's really no easier way to put this. It's about the quest to find God?
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship? What does God need with a starship? What does God need with a starship?
This may seem kind of out there, strange, perhaps. The Star Trek series and films have always dealt with high-concept science fiction topics. Even though there are obviously creative liberties being taken, most of what happens in the good parts of Star Trek is grounded in some layer of reality, at least. There's very little discussion of religion, and when it does come up, it's usually as a result of some backwards alien race that still clings to superstitious beliefs. An example of this would be the Next Generation episode, Who Watches the Watchers, where the crew of the Enterprise accidentally reveal themselves to a primitive alien species, who then start to revere them as gods. The plot of the episode revolves around Captain Picard trying to convince this species that he is not, in fact, a god. And Picard and the others seem to be actually quite critical of religion.
Dr. Barron, your report describes how rational these people are. Millennia ago, they abandoned their belief in the supernatural. Now you are asking me to sabotage that achievement, to send them back into the dark ages of superstition and ignorance and fear? No!
From the beginning, Star Trek has always been a very atheistic universe. Although some characters would occasionally express a vague belief in a god, it comes off more as a product of the time than the actual intention of Gene Roddenberry, the show's creator.
What else does mankind demand of its gods?
Mankind has no need for gods. We find the one quite adequate.
It's actually a bit more complicated than that. That was kind of a brief explanation. There's a great video by Steve Shives on the topic. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description. My point being, by the time Star Trek V came out in 1989, the franchise had pretty clearly grounded itself in the idea that humanity had evolved past the need for religion. After all, in a universe full of a near infinite supply of alien races from other inhabited worlds, most of our current-day Earth-born religions don't really make sense anymore. That's why the plot of this film in specific is so interesting to me. By nature of the premise, the story is forced to contend with this atheistic perspective and call it into question. But before we really dive into this movie, I should probably explain what happened in the previous few. I assume that some of you probably haven't seen these movies before. Leading up to the release of Star Trek V, the previous entry, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, had just concluded a 3-movie arc that started with Wrath of Khan. While the first film, Star Trek the Motion Picture, did establish that Kirk and his old crew are back aboard the Enterprise, it's largely unconnected from the sequels, kind of acting as a standalone adventure in the style of the original series. It's also my favorite one of the films by far, don't at me.
Red alert!
In Star Trek II, Kirk and his crew encounter an old enemy from the original series named Khan, who is now out to exact revenge on Kirk. In the resulting battle, Spock is forced to sacrifice himself to save the rest of the crew. In the third film, Spock is revealed to have been regenerated on a newly created artificial planet. So Kirk and the rest of the crew embark on a voyage to rescue their friend, which they do successfully. However, they were forced to steal the Enterprise to embark on the voyage, and so are court-martialed by Starfleet, leading into the fourth film, The Voyage Home. In this one, Kirk and his crew are forced to travel back in time in order to procure some whales to talk to a space probe and thereby save Earth.
Captain Kirk, you're charged of all these fucking crimes, but because you figured out that whales needed to talk to a space sausage, your rank is fully reinstated.
I honestly don't know how to explain it in such a short time frame, so you're just gonna have to trust me. That's what happens. So, for a while, there wasn't even going to be a fifth film. The Voyage Home pretty neatly wrapped up the three-part plot that was started in Wrath of Khan, and they were probably just gonna call it quits there. But, as I said before, The Voyage Home made a lot of money, surprisingly, to the point where it was the most financially successful of the entire original series of Star Trek films. So obviously a sequel needed to be made to capitalize on it. But because the plotline was complete, they needed to come up with something new. And that's how we got Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. The film opens on the planet Nimbus 3, where a wandering nomad is confronted by a man on horseback. The man dismounts and approaches the nomad, offering to share his pain. Now, we don't know it yet, but this is actually our primary antagonist, a Vulcan named Sybok. Sybok is on a quest to obtain the ultimate knowledge. To do this, according to him, he requires a starship. And after seemingly healing the nomad of his inner pain, he asks him to join him on his quest, which he agrees to. Meanwhile, back on Earth, our main three heroes, Admiral Kirk, Commander Spock, and Dr. McCoy, or Bones, are called away from a mountain camping trip to aid in a hostage crisis taking place on Nimbus 3. Believing that a human, Romulan, and Klingon diplomat have all been taken hostage, Kirk and his crew assemble and stage a rescue attempt. However, it turns out that they have been double-crossed, as the diplomats are all already working with Sybok, who takes the crew of the Enterprise hostage and proceeds to commandeer their ship by force. In order to keep the crew of the Enterprise compliant, Sybok has a special power in which he can remove the deep inner pain of anyone he touches.
How? By making you face your pain and draw strength from it. Once that's done, fear cannot stop you.
This is not unlike some modern-day religious organizations in which organizational leaders claim to have been granted holy power by their god. However, Sybok's treatment seems to actually work on some of the crew, including Bones and Spock. You could attribute this to the fact that Vulcans, the species Sybok belongs to, have been shown to have some amount of telepathic abilities. But what Sybok does is far beyond anything we've seen Spock do previously, our primary Vulcan character. Speaking of which, it is soon revealed that Sybok is actually the half-brother of Spock, confined to prison years ago for violating Vulcan beliefs about emotion. For those of you unaware, Vulcans in Star Trek are highly pragmatic, valuing logic and reason over emotion. As a result, Sybok stands out as one of the few Vulcan characters in the series to actually express a differing viewpoint on this subject. The clash between him and the comparatively reserved and pragmatic Spock is an interesting dichotomy, and I kind of wish we had gotten more of this interaction beyond just this one movie. Anyway, Sybok explains that his plan is to cross through the Great Barrier, an area of space that is presumed to be impossible to cross, in order to reach Shakari, the mythical planet in which God is supposed to reside. When Kirk asserts that crossing the Great Barrier will surely destroy the Enterprise, Sybok claims that he received a vision from God telling him that crossing the Great Barrier was indeed possible. Thus, as the Enterprise begins its journey towards Shakari, our trio is somewhat conflicted on the issue. Bones seems to be mostly convinced, Spock is indifferent, and Kirk is very skeptical. But to everyone's surprise, when they land on Shakari, God does in fact present himself.
Brave souls, welcome.
Is this the voice of God?
At first, it seems like all is well, but as the four characters continue to talk with God, Kirk begins to get suspicious. Throughout the conversation, God continues to drop little hints that he may not be exactly who he claims to be, until finally, he asks Sybok for use of his starship. And everything begins to unravel as soon as Kirk asks the famous question.
What does God need with a starship?
Bring the ship closer.
I said, what does God need with a starship?
Unwilling to answer the question, God strikes Kirk down with a lightning bolt, as well as Spock when he attempts to back him up. This is what finally shakes Bones from his previous devotion.
I doubt any god who inflicts pain for his own pleasure.
Even Sybok, who was previously completely devoted, is shaken. It is now revealed that this being is no god of any sort, but rather an extremely powerful being that was imprisoned on this planet many millennia ago, and only lured our characters here to free him of his imprisonment. Realizing this, our characters attempt to escape, Sybok providing a valiant distraction by sacrificing himself to the entity. Then, with a little help from a Klingon bird of prey that followed the Enterprise through the Great Barrier, our heroes are able to escape Shakari and go back to their regularly scheduled camping trip.
What are you doing?
I'm preparing to toast a marshmallow.
I'll be there.
So, what does God need with a starship? And why is it that this Star Trek movie, above all the rest, has stuck in my mind ever since I first saw it? Well, the simplest answer is that I've been going through a bit of an existential crisis for the past few years of my life. Growing up as a Protestant Christian in America, I began to witness what I perceived to be as pretty serious defects and inconsistencies in the Christian religion. The more I questioned, the more I was put off or dismissed. As I got more interested in history, I noticed that so many attempts at progression or understanding the world around us in a more logical way has been blocked historically at every turn by some form of religion. Not to mention the countless acts of violence and mass murder committed historically in the name of a god. I think Stephen Fry puts it best in this 2015 debate he participated in.
Oh, well, we couldn't know better because nobody else did. Then what are you for?
Okay.
I believe it was this contradiction. The idea that the church is the moral authority, that it acts in God's stead to provide us with moral clarity, and yet is so often responsible for so many heinous acts of brutality throughout history. It seems only natural that in this time of re-examining my religion and what it meant to me, I found myself compelled by Star Trek, a sci-fi franchise that pretty explicitly operates under the assumption that God doesn't exist, and moreover, humanity is fine without him. For a young adult like myself, being so deeply entrenched in the religious community, it was comforting to have a space to go to where I didn't have to worry about all that, where I had characters to admire that didn't conform to those standards, where I could watch an episode of Captain Picard yelling about how backwards religion is and feel validated when very few people in my life actually shared my opinions. In light of all that, it's not really surprising that this movie, one that most people generally overlook as one of the weaker entries in the franchise, somehow spoke to me on a deeper level. William Shatner, who also directed this movie, once described the premise as the Enterprise crew going in search of God, but instead finding the devil. In a way, I think that's what happened to me. I spent my entire adolescence searching for proof, searching for reason, searching for answers to my questions, the inconsistencies in my mind. And I never really found them. Much like Sybok, I wanted to believe that God was kind and caring and wanted what was best for my life. But when I really got up close and personal to examine my beliefs, I realized that God was never there to begin with. It can be scary and lonely to be in that place, especially as young as I was when it happened to me. But for a few hours or so, at least I could flip on one of the Star Trek movies, or maybe an episode of the TV show, and be reminded that humanity can be better than it is now. I can only hope that one day we will abandon our foolish prejudices and learn to live together in peace and harmony and acceptance. And for me, that's what Star Trek represents. That's what this movie represents. Just like Captain Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise, we may not have been able to find God. But in not finding him, maybe we're better for it. The choice, really, is up to you.
In a way, the good place was inside the bad place all along.
You know what? That's technically true. I'm gonna give it to you.
I just made an aphorism.